Superhero couples live in a fantasy world. Many of them have remained young for decades. As time goes on, with new stories and relationships emerging, it's inevitable that more and more become, nonsensical. First up, this isn't a couple you typically expect to see, which is why it makes my cut. But at the end of the day, while random, it doesn't mean that it's bad. In fact, what this relationship represented for both characters was kinda interesting. It also leads into one of the best series in the Age of X-Men era, which overall is a pretty weird and kinda controversial era, I think, for a lot of comic book fans in the X-Men history for sure. In Age of X-Men, the whole reason that Bishop basically ends up in prison, as seen in the Age of X-Men Prisoners, which is the one that I'm saying is, one of the best series, is because of his secret love affair with Jean Grey. This is because love and intimate relationships are outlawed in this world, all part of Nate Grey's plan to save the world and turn it into a paradise, by removing the conflicts often created by love. The original idea was to have Bishop in a secret love affair with Storm, according to Marvel senior editor Jordan White, but they ultimately decided to pair him with Jean instead because, well, Jean doesn't get to have a variety of romances really in the comics, which honestly is really true. She primarily is either paired with Wolverine or Cyclops, so to see her paired with Bishop, it's weird, but it's kinda cool. I kinda like it for them. Although I guess it's also kinda weird because when you think about the fact that Bishop is good friends with Cable, it's kinda like Jean's son. That's a little bit weird, but there's a lot of things that are weird. I just realized that. When it comes to just weird connections in comics, I mean, there's a lot of them. Is there any weird ones that you have read before where people were related but were romantically interested, or just like there's weird time travel things that just make it bizarre? Let me know what you think some of the weirdest relationships in comics are in the comments, because honestly, even when I think I'm talking about something that isn't weird, it is. That's so strange. This next one is honestly really a doozy. One of the worst on our list. The worst! And if you're wondering how it can possibly get worse than what I'm about to tell you now, I encourage you to stick around until the very end of this video, because it can get worse, I know. Although this one is definitely up there for me personally. We're talking about the terrible pairing of Hal Jordan and Arissa Rabb. Both superheroes, both Green Lanterns, one of whom was more like a kid sister to the other. And yeah, I'm not talking about Hal. Hal was not the kid sister in this scenario. Yeah, Arissa had basically like a schoolgirl crush on Hal that ended up manifesting in her using her ring to basically age herself up. Well, initially, Hal did rebuke Arissa's interest in him. Once she kind of willed herself to be aged up using her powers, he became a little bit more open to the idea of them being in a romantic relationship. If you're thinking that sounds super weird and disturbing, yes. Yes, it was. Scarlet Witch and Captain America are an odd couple because they aren't a couple you'd normally think of happening in the comics, especially if you are a fan whose initial introduction to these two was mainly through the MCU. They also mostly get together because Scarlet Witch is kinda lonely. Scarlet Witch is like, look, she got a lot of issues. I feel bad for her, really. And at least when we're talking about her motivation, I think in this relationship, that's kind of why. Also, like I said, she was going through a lot of stuff. The relationship was kind of part of that, being inherently problematic, just a bunch more of Wanda's stuff overflowing, as Wanda had basically ensorcelled Captain America to make him believe they were more of an item than they were. Fortunately, he broke free of her control, but there is also an alternate world where they actually just end up together earlier on, and Wanda ultimately kind of just like gets her hooks in Cap. The two become a couple who are responsible for basically reshaping the world, forcing it into this paradise vision they have for it after turning on their friends in their own alternate Avengers Disassembled. Basically like Avengers Disassembled if they were teamed up together, which honestly is pretty sad. Oh boy, oh bub. We are not talking about Wolverine in this next couple, but the next one is making me channel the sheer amazed reaction of Wolverine to his like flame covered adamantium coated claws just on the ground, like ah! At least in the fan edited version of that page where he returns from death with his flame claws. If you haven't seen it, it's great. There's just so many bubs on the page. When I first read it, I thought it was real, and then I went back to Return of Wolverine and I was like, man, I wish that fan edit was real. It's kind of great. Here we're talking about a couple from DC Comics, Batman and Black Canary. If you're thinking that sounds bizarre, that's because, well, it is. While these two briefly were a part of a love triangle in the main continuity in the past, way in the past, this relationship from Frank Miller's Batman universe, as seen in All-Star Batman and Robin, is honestly just so random. Why do these two hook up? I guess just because they're both insanely hot vigilantes, I got nothing else. This relationship is even more random than the last, and if you're thinking how is that possible, trust me, it's possible. It happened when Tony Stark's Iron Man found himself teaming up with the Guardians of the Galaxy. One night at a bar where they were all out together, he started to kinda like flirt with Gamora, and surprisingly, Gamora flirted back with him. They ended up back on the spaceship and had a quick fling. Sometime after Iron Man applied he could do better than just impressing a woman with his wealth. After they, finished, Gamora decided to go back to the bar. Meanwhile, Iron Man seemingly just chose to stay in bed in some level of pain after their encounter. I have to imagine based on Gamora's characterization that, he had an experience. This next one is just straight up weird. Batwoman and Nocturna were not in a healthy relationship, which is honestly why they're making my cut here. It's weird and it's gross in a bad way. Nocturna in essence manipulated Kate into having a relationship with her, and this relationship kind of also followed the very serious one Kate had with Maggie, which wasn't manipulative and actually almost led to these two women getting married in the comics. Unfortunately, there were too many hurdles for the couple and the creative team behind their engagement to climb for the two to end up with their happy ending, down the aisle, finally committing to each other. Alas, they ended up breaking off their engagement, and instead Kate was trapped in this toxic relationship with Nocturna for a while. A relationship where Nocturna manipulated Kate into being with her, and then also made Kate believe that she herself was a vampire and a monster, when really that's basically Nocturna's thing, not Kate's thing. Nocturna really seemed to be competing with the Joker here for the worst romantic partner in all of comic book history award, although I think the Joker still takes it. This next ship is just a weird one, but especially when you consider that these two very nearly tied the knot. They both come from two kind of different but adjacent worlds. We're talking about StarLord from Guardians of the Galaxy and Kitty Pryde, aka Kate or Cat from the X-Men. The adjacent bit is that both these teams are known to go to space. They got lots of space adventures. While the X-Men are an Earth-based primarily team, they do have a lot of space adventures, it's true. Which was how Kitty met Peter. They decided to keep in contact even though Kitty went back to Earth with the X-Men and Peter remained in space, and began a sort of like long distance relationship thing. This would eventually lead to Kitty coming to space to rescue Peter, and then choosing to remain there and kind of date and go on adventures with him more. Eventually they'd become engaged, and he'd even have to leave the Guardians, and she would basically take over for him for a while as StarLord. Even though these two are kind of weird together in some ways, they do still work as a couple, I have to admit, but neither of them is really the first person you'd think of when it comes to either's ideal or most iconic relationships. Like, they work together, but it's still just kind of weird. Batman and Batgirl are an even more bizarre pairing. This is because they are literally like family, and there is such a big age gap that's implied to be between them. Batman is the friend and ally of Jim Gordon, who in many continuities is Barbara Gordon's father, either adoptive or biological, so that's kinda like Batman dating his friend's kid, kinda? Yeah, it's messed up. Fortunately, these two have not made their way to the main comic book continuity as a couple, and instead are pretty much only paired up in the Batman animated series universe, which there are comics of, but it's not main continuity, but you know, still, it's, yeah. If you thought Batman and Batgirl together were strange as two people who are close to having a kind of a father-daughter, or at least kind of like an uncle-niece relationship, this next one is going to straight up blow your mind. We're talking about the relationship between Superman and Supergirl. Yeah, what? Well, don't worry. As strange as this one may sound, it happened in an alternate reality where the two are actually not cousins at all. In fact, both of them are actually from different realities than each other. This was Linda Danvers, who is only kind of filling in for Kara at the time in the comics, and unlike Kara, she was not a Kryptonian and she was not related to Superman. The Superman she ended up with was also, I believe, a different version of Superman from Earth 1, not the New Earth version. New Earth at that time was the main continuity of DC, this is before Prime Earth, I digress. Still, just the idea of Superman and Supergirl ending up as married, just looking at that on a page, given that most people usually think of them as cousins, is pretty weird. It's pretty weird that we paired them at all. Finally, the pièce de résistance, the most nonsensical couple I have for you today, Nate Gray and Madeline Pryor. Insanely bizarre when you consider that Madeline Pryor is the mother of Cable, aka Nathaniel Summers, who is an alternate version of course, Nate Gray. And even if we're willing to let this go somewhat, because Maddie isn't actually Nate's mom since he's from an alternate world, he just looks kinda similar to and is an alternate version of her son Cable, there is still the fact that Madeline is of course a clone of Jean Grey, and Jean Grey is still Nate's biological mother. The only way I can even think of how Marvel justified this when they gave it a pass and were like, yeah, you can print that, is that Nate wasn't actually raised by Scott or Jean really in his universe. He was like a test tube baby created by Sinister who escaped Sinister's clutches, and then instead he was raised by his adoptive father Forge. But still, this is weird, right? The genetic crossover is, it's weird. That's about it for this one. I have been myself today, Amanda McKnight. Until next time, you stay nerdy, YouTube.